Good evening, everybody. You are watching Mario's History Talks. I'm Mario Rostovsky, and we have a terrific show for you this evening. So, we left off last time discussing a major point of contention in traditional Bulgarian historiography concerning their claim to Macedonia. As we discussed, not only did Khan Kubur fail to make any cohesive Bulgar state in Macedonia, much less make Bulgarians out of the local Macedonians, but, and this is a big but, his army was not even majority Bulgars. So he would not have been able to significantly alter the genetic nor the cultural makeup of the local Macedonians. But eventually, this does change. Despite other attempts to invade and conquer Macedonia that also ended in failure, the Bulgars finally managed to conquer Macedonia in the mid to late 800s, some 173 years after their arrival to Europe. So, just a quick recap of the time frame so far so you're not confused as we move forward. We started talking about the emergence of the Slavic-speaking tribes in the Balkans in the 550s, the unsuccessful attacks on Salonika by Hadzon in the early 600s, and the emergence of the Bulgars in 670 and Kubur's failed attempt to create a Bulgar state in Macedonia in the 680s. So we're moving right along. Chronologically, we're doing just fine. Let's see what happened next. The 700s were marked by a period of civil war and general unrest in Bulgaria, as the old Dulo royal family finally died out. And as you remember, this is the Hunno-Turkic tribe that Asparuch and Kubur, among others, descended from. Now, we won't get into this too much as this won't be really relevant to our discussion tonight. However, I will say this. Some Bulgarian historians, like the aforementioned and famous Zlatarsky, again use this opportunity to push a romanticized narrative concerning the relations between the Bulgars and the Slavs, which, if you do trust Bulgarian interpretation of history, were warm and cozy and fuzzy right from the beginning, and they immediately formed this alliance and almost a federation. So Zlatarsky, with this perspective in mind, proposes that the civil war was actually between the rival factions of the boyars, or the Bulgar military elite, debating over the role of the Slavs in this empire, with one side supposedly wanting to keep them at bay, down, and second-class citizens, while the other side wanted to integrate them into the authority of the state as equals. However, once again, this theory is highly speculative, and Dr. Fine, he rejects it outright as one of the main causes of the war. And furthermore, we know from Byzantine historians like Theophanes that not only were both groups at this time period still regarded as separate, but we also see that the Slavs were at best subservient and paying taxes to the Bulgars, and at worst, brutally subjugated by them. So, as we have to remember, Bulgars did regard them as their enemies. Take a look at this Bulgar inscription written in Greek concerning Khan Omurtag and his army's fight against their enemies, the Greeks and the Slavs. In this inscription, he literally said he would hunt down the Greeks and the Slavs so long as the sun shines in the sky and the river Ticha flowed. Big yikes. As you can imagine, other points, there were even petitions by the local Slavs to rid themselves of Bulgarian rule, to escape that brutality, even trying to accept Frankish rule as opposed to Bulgarian rule. But that's a whole other episode. So anyway, out of this period of unrest, the Byzantines are increasing their warfare against the Bulgarians. Finally, a Khan by the name of Telik takes over the throne of Bulgaria. And as he does take over, some 208,000 Slavs flee Bulgaria for the safety of Byzantium. Again, not the best living conditions for them. So this Khan Telik is eventually deposed, and afterwards there's a string of insignificant Bulgars that follow him, until finally Khan Telereg takes over the throne and establishes order in the Bulgarian Empire. Part of his reign coincides with increased warfare with the Byzantines, but it's also marked by yet another attempt to invade the Macedonian territory. And in this particular case, he tried to invade the territory of Brzetia in Macedonia with some 12,000 Bulgars, attempting to enslave the local population and send them back to Bulgaria. This, as before, does fail. So again, I ask you, does this paint a picture of warm and friendly relations between the Macedonian Sclavini and the Bulgars, who would apparently, eventually, voluntarily meld themselves into a new Bulgarian ethnos? To me, not quite. Now, obviously quite a lot happens during this time period, which we'll not be able to cover as most of it's insignificant, but know that by this time period, Bulgaria has started to slowly establish itself as a formidable state in the Balkans, covering a vast expanse of territory. This was particularly seen with Khan Krum's rule, who managed to expand Bulgaria into all directions, covering Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Serbia, Montenegro, and even parts of Bosnia and Croatia. However, you notice what's missing? You guessed it, Macedonia. Macedonia was still not under Bulgar occupation. Despite this, these other territories that were arguably under the Bulgarian state for much, much longer, it was only the Macedonians and not anybody else who in the shortest amount of time would become true, bona fide, and pure Bulgarians. Pretty crazy, right? Well, nonetheless, this did kind of start to change with the reign of Khan Presian. The Byzantines at this time, knowing that some Sclaveni in the region of Salonika were attempting to rebel against their rule, did ask the Bulgars to help put them down as a rebellion, while at the same time they planned to secretly and covertly go up the Danube, surprise the Bulgars, and rescue some Macedonians that were being held hostage up there. So the Bulgars found out about this, and as a result, decided to further punish the Macedonian Slavic tribes. Khan Presian sent this Kafkan Igbul to essentially conquer the city of Plovdiv and brutally subjugate the Macedonian tribe of the Smoljani. And ironically enough, these are the ancestors to the modern-day Pirin Macedonians, among other groups. So, thankfully for this, we do know what happened. This interaction is recorded in a stone inscription left by the Bulgars at the local church. It states, "Of the many Bulgarians, the god Lord Presian sent Ispul, the Kafkan, which means general, having given him military forces, and the Ichirgu Boil and the Kanboil, Kolobran, and the Kafkan against the Smoljani. Someone seeks the truth, and God watches. And if one lies, God also watches. The Bulgarians did many good things to the Christians, i.e. the Byzantines, and the Christians forgot this, but God still watches." Now, the words you didn't understand in that sentence are actually remnants of the original Bulgarian language. So, moving ahead though, as you can imagine, given the content of this, Bulgarians again try to paint a different picture to support their romanticized view of a symbiotic Bulgarian-Slavic union, and to do so, they actually translate the Greek word for against to mean for, as in the Bulgarians were sending their Bulgarian troops to help the Smoljani tribe. Also, worth noting that despite all this, the context is still quite clear. He had to send his top generals, the Kafkan Igbul, to do this. It was not a peaceful incursion at all. And this is the first recorded Bulgarian attempt to conquer Macedonia on a large scale. But after that, we do have a bit of a gap in the history. Macedonia is comfortably under Bulgar rule by about 860, but because after that, there are no more wars recorded with the Byzantine Empire. So it had to have happened roughly before 860. So with that being said, Bulgarians insist it actually happened with the remainder of Presian's campaign in Macedonia around 843 AD. Big problem there as well, because in that period, there's also no wars recorded with the Byzantine Empire. Sometimes they weren't the best record keepers, and there's no record of any Byzantine recognition of any loss of territory to the Bulgars, which would have happened. But The absence of evidence here is taken and twisted by the Bulgarians to mean evidence of absence. And they hypothesize that because there's no wars recorded, the Slavs and the Bulgars voluntarily annexed themselves and attached themselves to their brethren in the Bulgarian state, i.e. the Slavs and the Bulgars. So this is absurd for a number of reasons. For one, we know that violence was used and was seen in the inscription. Presian had sent all his top military generals against the Smoljani. And we know from Kuber's time that any Bulgarians that were left in Macedonia would have been so insignificant and so small, they would have easily lost their Bulgarian identity and been absorbed by the larger Macedonians and would have been Slavicized. So there wasn't really one Bulgarian entity merging with the other. And finally, think of it this way. What motivation would these Macedonian Sclavini have had to even want to annex themselves to a distant Hunno-Turkic entity? Slavs were not in any position of power in the Bulgarian state, this was well known, and they had just suffered at the hands of Presian's Kafkan Igbul in Pirin, Macedonia. Macedonians would have also doubtless remembered that the 7,000 or 6,000 Thracians were slaughtered and massacred when the Bulgars finally captured the city of Sredets, modern-day Sofia. Talk about irony. And of course, we can't go on without mentioning that during this time period, there were still two distinct cultures forming in Macedonia and Bulgaria because of different founding stock of people. We have a Slavic Macedonian Byzantine culture in Macedonia as a result of the mixing of ancient Macedonians and the Sclaveni, whoever they were. We'll get into that later. And in Bulgaria, we have a Bulgarian pagan Slavic mix as a result of the Bulgars, the Anti, and the Thracians mixing. So either way you spin it, though, this had to have happened. This annexation of Macedonia into Bulgaria had to have happened between roughly 843 and 852 AD, which was actually when Presian's son Boris took over. And what does Boris do that fundamentally reverses years upon years of Bulgarian failure in permanently controlling Macedonia? Well, as I said before, if the Macedonians would not become like the Bulgars would become like the Macedonians. Whereas years of failed military expeditions proved useless in winning over the Macedonians to the Bulgarian rule, to the Bulgarian Empire, Boris saw he needed to be a diplomat, not a warrior. This man was brilliant. He saw, with the conversion of the Saxons, most of Europe was now becoming Christian, leaving Bulgaria the odd ball out. As such, in 863 AD, Boris undertook a dramatic and forced conversion of pagan Bulgaria into Christianity. Now, this is actually a very complicated chapter in Balkan history, and you kind of have to understand that in this time period there was a big tug of war because the Balkans was a center place of a competition between the Roman Western Rite and the Eastern Byzantine Rite, despite all being one empire, as complicated as that sounds. So the fact that Boris chose to be baptized in the Eastern Rite was purely a political move. In fact, he actually turned to the Western Rite through the Germanic Franks first, but it was due to shrewd maneuvering and political calculations by both Boris himself and the Byzantines that he actually went through the Eastern Rite. So now names that you know like Asparuk, Omurtag, Pagan, and Izbul, they become replaced with Slavic and Orthodox names like Simeon, like Mikhail, like Peter, like Jovan. Their Turkic Tengri religion would be replaced with the worship of Jesus Christ. Even their Bulgarian language, the Turkic language, would prove useless for this new state and this new religious identity. However, despite this, there are still records that it may have survived well into the 12th century. Still can't be 100% confirmed, but nonetheless, imagine, even after the conversion of Boris to Christianity, there was still one part of the population in Bulgaria speaking a language that the other part never even heard, never even was familiar with, yet somehow they were still one people. As you can imagine, this was not well received by the Bulgars. In fact, you have to remember there was heavy, brutal persecution of Christians by the Khans Omurtag and Malamir. Now suddenly, Christianity is supposed to be the state religion? Not so fast. So in fact, a group of boyars in 866 did try to launch an attack against Boris, now renamed Michael, to restore traditional Bulgar paganism in Bulgaria. This was, as you can imagine, brutally suppressed by Boris. And after all was said and done, and Boris tried to live out the remainder of his life in a monastery studying scripture and the Gospels, his own son, who had succeeded him, actually tried to reverse his father's policies and reinstate Bulgar paganism in Bulgaria. So this was not popular at all. Boris steps out of retirement, blinds his own son, puts somebody else on the throne named Simeon, and the future for a Christian Bulgaria, complete with its own independent patriarchate, is preserved. So here's what you have to know. This was the first time the Macedonians were part of an empire that did not force Hellenization upon them, and it had churches, it had state authority, it even had universities in their native language. This was huge. And remember, by this point, the majority of Macedonians, they would have had little to no contact with the actual Bulgars outside of maybe the warriors. The Bulgars, they were still largely centered along the Danube River, and whatever the term Bulgarian might have meant in the mind of a Macedonian up until this stage, it was now irrelevant. Bulgarian came to mean Slavic for the first time in history. And whereas the previously multi-ethnic Bulgarian Empire was said to be composed of mainly Bulgars and Slavs with different languages, different cultures, and different religions, it was now all Bulgarians, a civic identity denoting citizenship in this new Slavic and Orthodox Bulgarian Empire. And of course, the acceptance of this Bulgarian civic identity, well, that was also heavily helped by the work of the students of St. Cyril and Methodius, namely St. Clement and St. Naum, who, despite probably being Macedonian locals themselves, well, they spread Slavic literacy and religious education all across Macedonia and all using the Bulgarian name. But there's really nothing that should surprise you here. The Greek language, which was the language native to the Hellenes, that was renamed Romaic when the Romans took it over and used it as the official language for their own empire, the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire. But nonetheless, for all the failures of the Bulgars up until now, and as you know, there were many, this is what finally won them over, won over the Macedonians to the Bulgarian side, to the point they even accepted the name Bulgarian to describe themselves in the future. Now, this is actually a very complicated subject for another episode, but we have to know is all of this was almost incidental. I mean, when Bulgaria first converted to Christianity by Tsar Boris, they were given Greek clergy to help in the process. It was only incidentally because St. Cyril and Methodius' students that they were exiled from Great Moravia and that they were welcomed to Bulgaria by Tsar Boris that the Slavic language, not the Greek language, began to take hold in Bulgaria as the official language of the church and the administration. If history up until this point was any indication about the future, it surely would have been the Greek language, because that was the official language of the administration of the Bulgars since the establishment of their state in 681. And think of it like this now. Even though Slavic languages were still all largely uniform and intelligible by this stage, we see with the Ohrid Literary School, where the first inklings of the Macedonian recension of Church Slavic, something accepted by linguists, happened, and this is what would go on to become the actual Macedonian language. This all happened under an empire called Bulgarian. Think of the impact this would have had on our language for centuries to come. Even if Standard Macedonian would eventually diverge from Standard Spoken Bulgarian, and we know this happened obviously, but our ancestors, even if they couldn't understand those in Preslav, they would still call their language Bulgarian, precisely because of this historical precedent of the Bulgarian Empire. And if language, as well as church, if these two things are seen as the prime markers of a people and a national identity, well, The implications of this on the development of an independent Macedonian identity, this would have been cataclysmic throughout the centuries. But that, my friends, is the subject for the next episode. So in the meantime, rewatch this episode at your leisure. I'll be posting Mario's Minutes to social media in the coming days. In the meantime, definitely stay safe. I'm going to get to work on that new episode. You're absolutely going to love it. It's going to tackle a very tricky issue in our history, namely, what did the Bulgarian label mean after the rise and fall of the Bulgarian Empire? Very, very juicy stuff. So in the meantime, keep studying, keep safe, honestly, be healthy, and keep fighting for Macedonia. I'm going to see you again soon, so golem pozdrav.